The air inside the sleek, titanium-walled elevator was scrubbed and recycled, smelling faintly of ozone and terrifying authority. It was a silence so absolute that the sudden hum of the security scanner felt like a physical blow. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the digital panel as it shifted from a neutral blue to a deep, tactical crimson. My father, Colonel Red Bull Miller, a man who believed that if you weren't shouting, you weren't leading, stood beside me, waiting for the doors to open so he could charm whatever general he thought we were meeting. But the doors didn't open. Instead, the floor dropped out from under us, bypassing the executive suites entirely, plunging us straight down into the bedrock. Then the voice filled the small space, synthetic, genderless, and impossibly loud. Identity confirmed. Welcome, Director Nightfall. Level 7, Black Site Protocol. I didn't move a muscle, but I could feel my father's presence beside me collapse. He didn't just pale. He looked as though the physics of his world had suddenly dissolved. His mouth hung slightly open, the confident, boisterous grin he'd worn all morning, erased by a dawning, horrific realization. He looked at me like he was seeing a ghost, or perhaps a predator he had mistaken for a pet. 5 minutes ago, he was telling me to fetch him a coffee and hold his coat. Now he was locked in a steel box, plummeting toward a classified sub-basement with the highest-ranking officer he had ever stood next to, and he was just realizing it was his daughter. To understand how the power dynamic flipped this violently, we have to go back to the security checkpoint just 30 minutes earlier. It was Family Day at the Pentagon. A chaotic pageant of strollers, spouses, and retired veterans eager to relive their glory days. The visitor center smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, vibrating with the noise of 1,000 conversations. My father was in his element, wearing his veteran cap and holding court near the metal detectors, boasting to a group of strangers about his time in the 82nd Airborne. I was behind the glass at the badge processing station trying to print his guest pass, but the ancient machine had decided to jam. It was a minor technical snag, the kind that happens 100 times a day. But for my father, it was an invitation to perform. He slammed his hand on the counter, startling the young mother next to him. "God, Maya, it's a printer, not a live grenade," he barked, his voice cutting through the din of the room. "Move aside and let a man handle it. You're holding up the line." I felt that familiar coldness settle in my stomach, the heavy, tired weight of a lifetime of public corrections. I kept my face neutral, my fingers working the release latch on the printer. But he wasn't finished. He turned to the military police officer on duty, a young corporal standing at the turnstile, and offered a conspiratorial wink. "She's administrative support," my father said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You know how these HR girls are. Soft hands, slow heads. She panics if the stapler runs out." The corporal froze. He looked at the badge I was printing. Then he looked at my face. Recognition flashed in his eyes. Absolute, terrified recognition. He knew my face from the classified briefings he guarded. He knew that administrative support was the cover story for a director of clandestine cyber operations. I saw his hand twitch, an instinctual move to snap to attention and salute. But I locked eyes with him. I gave him a micro shake of my head, a silent, imperceptible order to stand down. I had to swallow the insult to maintain my cover, forcing a polite, apologetic smile onto my face as I handed my father his pass. He snatched it from my hand without a thank you, utterly convinced that he was the shark in the tank, never suspecting he was the one swimming in deep water. My father lived in a world that stopped turning in 1989. To him, respect was measured in decibels and the amount of mud caked on your boots. If you weren't shouting orders over the roar of a helicopter or sleeping in a foxhole, you weren't serving. You were just taking up space on the payroll. He called it real soldiering, a phrase he used like a cudgel to beat down anyone who didn't fit his cinematic John Wayne image of warfare. And I was the antithesis of his hero. I didn't carry a rifle. I carried a tablet. I didn't yell, I whispered. And to a man like Colonel Miller, silence was synonymous with weakness. He never missed a chance to remind me of where I stood in his hierarchy. He'd spend hours on the phone with my cousin Travis, a sergeant in the infantry, who could barely spell his own name, but knew how to dig a trench. I'd sit at Sunday dinner listening to Dad gush about Travis's Gritton Field promotions while he introduced me to his friends as his little secretary, or the girl who plays video games for the government. It wasn't just the nicknames that stung. It was the total eraser of my existence. I remembered the nights I spent studying cryptography until my eyes bled, the missed holidays because of an escalating crisis in the Pacific, the sheer mental exhaustion of my training. He saw none of it. In his ledger, my sacrifices were valued at 0 because I didn't come home smelling like gunpowder. If he only knew the truth, his brain probably wouldn't be able to process it. In the sanitized, air-conditioned world, he mocked. I wasn't Maya the secretary. I was Director Nightfall. My battlefield didn't have a front line. It was everywhere. I ran Operation Silent Grid, an initiative so classified that the paperwork alone required clearances he didn't even know existed. Yankee white sap levels that made his old top-secret clearance look like a public library card. While he was bragging about commanding a battalion of 500 men, I was sitting in a dark room authorizing code injections that could dissolve the banking infrastructure of a hostile nation in 6 seconds flat. He thought power was holding a weapon. I knew the truth. Power is the ability to turn off the lights in a capital city without ever leaving your desk. But on that tour, I was just the daughter dragging behind him the embarrassing civilian accessory to his glorious return. We reached the corridor leading to the National Military Command Center, the famous war room. The hallway was blocked by a velvet rope and a young tour guide, a corporal who looked like he was fresh out of boot camp. My father didn't just walk up to the rope, he marched. He pulled out his retired identification card, the plastic yellowed with age, and flashed it with the confidence of a man who expects the Red Sea to part. Colonel Miller retired, he announced loud enough for the 3 groups behind us to hear. I'm going to take a look inside. Show my daughter here where the big boys play. The corporal didn't flinch. I'm sorry, sir, he said, his voice polite but firm. The NMCC is a restricted zone. Active duty personnel with specific authorization only. It's not part of the public tour. It was the standard script, the same one they gave everyone, but my father took it as a personal declaration of war. His face went that dangerous shade of purple I knew too well, the color that usually preceded a broken plate or a ruined birthday. Restricted, he sputtered, stepping over the line. Son, I was commanding battalions when you were in diapers. I held a TS clearance before you were a glint in your daddy's eye. Get me your supervisor right now. The scene was unraveling fast. Tourists were staring, whispering behind their hands. The corporal was reaching for his radio, his patience thinning. That's when my father turned on his heel and pointed a finger directly at my chest. Fix this, Maya, he snapped, his tone dismissive, like he was ordering me to clean up a spill. Use your little HR pull and get me in. Tell this kid who I am. Make yourself useful for once instead of just standing there like a statue. The words hung in the air. Make yourself useful. It echoed every other time he'd looked through me. Every time he'd relegated my career to paper pushing. Every time he'd asked when I was going to get a real job. He stood there, chest puffed out, demanding I use my administrative non-existent pull to get him into a room he wasn't cleared for. Completely oblivious to the fact that I had been briefing the Joint Chiefs in that very room 3 hours ago. He wanted to see the war room. He wanted to see where the real decisions were made. I decided it was time to show him. Not the one on the tour map, the real one. I checked the chronometer on my wrist, 07:55 hours, and felt the second hand ticking against my pulse. My shift as director was about to begin, and legally I should have dropped him off at the gift shop to buy a commemorative mug while I vanished into the secure wing. But looking at him, his chest puffed out, his face red with the exertion of belittling me in front of strangers. Something inside me snapped into a cold, predatory focus. I wasn't just going to endure this visit. I was going to end it. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to that hush he associated with submission, but was actually the quiet before a strike. "Okay, Dad," I said, keeping my face perfectly smooth. "I can get you into the command sector, but you have to be quiet. Protocol is stricter than you remember." A wide, triumphant grin split his face, the look of a man who thinks he's bullied the world into obedience. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, nearly buckling my knees, finally showing some initiative. "Girl," he boomed, oblivious to the stares of the tourists around us. "Don't worry, I know how to handle the brass. You just swipe the card and I'll do the talking. We don't want you stuttering in front of a flag officer." I forced a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach my eyes. He thought he was walking into a very important person tour. He didn't realize he was walking into a kill box. I led him away from the public concourse toward the executive elevator bank, a sterile alcove where the steel doors had no call buttons, only biometric scanners that cost more than my father's house. Waiting there was General Vance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man with 4 stars on his shoulder and the weight of the free world in his eyes. My father stiffened instantly, his spine snapping straight as if electrified. He threw up a salute so aggressive it bordered on parody. "General," he barked. "Colonel Miller, 82nd Airborne, retired. Honor to stand with you, sir." General Vance didn't even blink. He offered my father a curt, barely there nod, the kind you give a piece of furniture you're trying to walk around, before his eyes locked onto me. His expressions softened into genuine professional respect, the look a commander gives their most valuable asset. "After you, ma'am," he said, stepping aside to clear my path to the scanner. I saw my father's chest swell with a different kind of pride, a smug, patronizing satisfaction. He leaned in, whispering loudly in my ear. "See, that's a gentleman, Maya. Old school. He's letting the lady go first." I almost laughed. He thought it was chivalry. He couldn't conceive that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was waiting for his superior to open the door. Dad puffed out his chest, thinking he was about to ride with a general. He didn't realize the general was just waiting for me to unlock the door. We stepped into the heavy silence of the car, the doors sealing shut with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like an airlock closing on a submarine. The interior was sleek, stripped of any ornamentation, just brushed steel and a single smooth panel of black glass. My father frowned, his hand hovering over the featureless surface where the buttons should have been, his confusion morphing instantly into irritation. He tapped the glass aggressively, leaving a smudge, then turned to me with that familiar, weary sigh, the one he used when the world wasn't bending to his will fast enough. "Where are the buttons? Is this thing broken?" He chuckled, shaking his head at General Vance as if sharing a joke about incompetent equipment. "Use the stairs next time, honey. This is obviously for high command, not for the tourists." I didn't answer him. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to explain, to apologize, or to shrink. I stepped forward, bypassing him entirely, and reached into my blazer pocket. I didn't pull out the laminated paper guest pass he was wearing. I pulled out a heavy slab of unmarking black titanium. It had no photo, no name, just a single embedded microchip that cost more than my father's entire pension. I felt the cool metal against my thumb, a tangible weight that anchored me, and slotted it into a nearly invisible groove in the wall. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The standard white overhead lighting died, plunging us into total darkness for a split second before the car was flooded with a deep, pulsing tactical red. It was the color of a submarine running silent, the color of a drone feed before the strike, the color of war. My father gasped, backing up until he hit the wall, his hands raising instinctively as if he were under attack. Then the audio system kicked in, the voice filling the small space not from a speaker, but seemingly from the walls themselves. It was synthetic, loud, and terrifyingly devoid of humanity. Biometric scan initiated. A horizontal laser swept across the car, hitting my face and warming my skin as it mapped my iris patterns. My father stood frozen, his eyes darting around the red-lit box, waiting for an alarm, waiting for security to drag us out for touching something we shouldn't have. Retinal match 100%. The voice boomed. Welcome, Director Nightfall. Override authorized. Destination, the hub. The elevator began to drop, not with the gentle hum of a hotel lift, but with the stomach-turning velocity of a free fall. I stood perfectly still, watching the blood drain from my father's face in the crimson light. His confident smile had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed horror that bordered on a stroke. He looked at General Vance, desperate for an ally, desperate for the 4-star general to laugh and say it was a prank, or to reprimand me for the glitch. But General Vance wasn't laughing. He wasn't even looking at my father. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had turned his back to the wall and was standing at parade rest, legs shoulder-width apart, hands locked behind his back, head snapped forward. It was a position of subordination. He was standing at attention for me. "General," my father whispered, his voice cracking, sounding smaller than I had ever heard it. What's happening?" General Vance didn't break his posture. He spoke to the air, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the descent like a razor. "Colonel, you are now in a sensitive compartmented information facility. If you speak to the director without permission, I will have you arrested for treason. Do you understand?" The word treason hung in the red air, heavy and absolute. My father began to physically shake. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time he didn't see Maya the secretary, or Maya the disappointment. He saw the stranger who outranked his heroes. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I was too busy reading the classified briefing that had just projected onto the glass wall, scrolling through casualty reports with a practiced board efficiency. I tallied his silence in my head, balancing it against every time he had told me to be quiet. Every time he had told me I didn't matter, the doors opened. My father stepped out, his knees weak. He looked for a place to sit, but there were no chairs for tourists in my world. The moment the elevator doors slid open, the silence of the ride was shattered by the low, rhythmic hum of the hub, the sound of 1,000 cooling fans, and the frantic clicking of keyboards. It was a noise that usually soothed me, a symphony of controlled chaos. That meant the world was being watched, analyzed, and protected. I stepped out onto the operations floor, and the atmosphere shifted instantly from the passive containment of the elevator to the electric urgency of command. The room was a cavernous amphitheater of blue light, dominated by a wall of screens stretching 3 stories high, displaying live satellite feeds, scrolling code, and heat maps of global conflict zones. This was the video game my father thought I played. A game where the pieces were nations and the stakes were absolute. I didn't have to look for my team. They were already moving toward me like a tide responding to the moon. A senior analyst, a woman with 2 PhDs who usually terrified the new recruits, fell into step beside me, thrusting a tablet into my hand. "Director, the satellite feed is live over the Black Sea," she said, her voice tight with the specific stress of an impending crisis. "We have confirmation on the payload movement. The Joint Chiefs are on a secure line, waiting for your go-ahead to initiate the jamming sequence." I took the tablet, my fingers dancing over the glass with a muscle memory born of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Tell the Chiefs to hold position," I ordered, not breaking my stride. "If we jam now, they'll switch to analog backups. Let the payload cross the threshold. We intercept the digital handshake at the source and get me the Cyber Warfare Division on a direct link. I want a localized blackout on my mark." Behind me, I could feel my father's presence fading, shrinking until he was nothing more than a ghost in the machine. I stopped at the railing of the command deck and finally turned back to look at him. He was still standing by the open elevator doors, but the arrogance that had defined him for my entire life had evaporated. He looked small, old, and dangerously obsolete. Two armed military police officers, men who looked like they were carved out of granite, had stepped up on either side of him. They weren't saluting him. They were watching him, their hands resting near their sidearms, treating the retired colonel, not as a dignitary, but as a potential security risk in a sanitized zone. I watched him take it all in. The massive screens, the differential way the staff looked at me, the terrifying reality of the clearance level I held. In his eyes, I saw the collapse of a decades-long narrative. He was remembering every time he'd called me soft, every time he'd mocked my desk job, every time he'd told his friends I was just administrative support. I saw him try to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman currently holding the power to darken a continent. It was a reckoning that didn't need words. The sheer undeniable weight of the room was crushing him. I walked back to him, my heels clicking sharply on the glass floor, the sound cutting through the ambient hum. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't gloat about the initiative he had so desperately wanted me to show. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a standard white plastic guest pass, the kind unrestricted visitors used for the public cafeteria. "I have work to do, Colonel," I said, my voice flat and stripped of any emotion, treating him with the same detached professionalism I would give a vendor who had wandered into the wrong building. "Security will escort you out. You can use this for the mess hall on the second floor if you're hungry, but you can't stay here." I pressed the pass into his trembling hand, his fingers feeling papery and weak against my own. "And Dad, don't touch anything on the way out." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on him and walked toward the console where the Joint Chiefs were waiting for my orders. The elevator doors hissed shut behind me, sealing him out of my world forever. It took a year for the dust to settle, a year of silence where the phone didn't ring with his usual demands or criticisms. We found ourselves at my Aunt Sarah's house for Thanksgiving, the air thick with the smell of roasted turkey and the loud, overlapping conversations of a family that only knows how to communicate at high volume. My father sat at the head of the table, but he was different, quieter, his posture less rigid, his eyes lacking that predatory need to dominate the room. He picked at his food, listening rather than broadcasting, a shadow of the bull miller who used to terrorize waitresses and privates alike. The inevitable moment came when my cousin's new fiancée, a bubbly woman who didn't know the family history, turned to me with a polite smile. "So, Maya," she chirped, oblivious to the tension that suddenly spiked at the table. "Your dad says you work in HR at the Pentagon. That must be interesting. How is work at the office?" I opened my mouth to give the standard vague answer I had perfected over a decade of deflection, but before I could speak, a heavy hand slammed onto the table, not in anger, but with a strange protective finality. "She's busy," my father interrupted, his voice rough but steady. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on his plate, stabbing a fork into his potatoes. "Leave her alone. She's saving the damn world." The table went silent. It wasn't an apology. Men like him don't apologize. They don't have the vocabulary for it, but it was something better. It was submission. It was an acknowledgement that the hierarchy had shifted, and he was no longer the one giving the orders. I looked at him, and I felt a strange, cool peace settle over me. I didn't need his pride. I didn't need his praise. I realized in that quiet moment over cold gravy that I had only ever needed his silence so I could do my job. And finally, after 30 years of fighting for it, I had got it. My father spent 30 years thinking rank was something you wore on your collar. It took a 10-second elevator ride for him to learn that real power is the card you keep in your pocket. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have known you best, hit that subscribe button. Here we know exactly who you are.